This is Matthew Cratter from Bitcoin University. It's good to be back after a few days off, and so I wanted to play a little bit of catch up here and talk about the BRICS countries and whether they're about to issue their own gold-backed currency. There's been a lot of news in the past couple of weeks. BRICS planning to introduce a new trading currency backed by gold at the August summit. Gold standard will be a great benefit to strengthening single currency. 41 countries have applied for BRICS membership. This is courtesy of RT and Willem Middelkoop, this breaking news. So for those of you who don't know, the BRICS countries are obviously Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, sort of an acronym for those countries. There's a slight problem, though, that none of these countries really have a whole lot in common with each other culturally, apart from perhaps a common hatred of oppressive US dollar hegemony. So just on the face of it, it's hard to imagine some of these countries working together, especially when they're so geographically dispersed. Now, how does a gold standard work? Well, basically, you print up a bunch of paper or digital money, in this case, that would be backed by physical gold that would be stored somewhere. And that's one of the problems with this, which we're going to talk about. Now, theoretically, that paper money or digital money could always be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. In other words, the currency would be convertible, at least at the beginning. Now, there are possible problems. Biggest problem really is in which country do you store the physical gold that is backing the currency? Does China, for example, get to hold all of it? That would make sense since China is clearly the most powerful BRICS nation. But if you do this, then the BRICS currency will basically devolve into a Chinese-controlled currency. This is like that old joke about the golden rule. He who has the gold rules. And this is certainly true for a gold standard as well. And when the world was on a gold standard in the 1900s, after Bretton Woods, it was really all the gold was being stored in U.S. banking vaults. And that led to other countries inevitably having to trust the U.S. that it would have enough gold to back its currency, which it ended up not having. So that's one problem. Or do you hold equal amounts of gold in each of the 5 BRICS countries? If the new BRICS currency succeeds, then these stockpiles of gold will need to grow and be constantly balanced between the 5 countries if you want to be completely fair and give them the same weighting. And this would mean, this rebalancing would mean having to put lots of shiny yellow rocks on boats and airplanes and moving them around the world. This is almost comical to imagine in the increasingly digital 21st century. This is almost like moving backwards. And this is one problem with people who are in favor of gold and the gold standard. They tend to be very anti-progressive and anti-tech. Here's another scenario. What if 5% of the gold backing this currency is on a boat that sinks into the Mariana Trench, one of the deepest parts of the ocean in the Pacific, and cannot be recovered? Do you get a depegging of the currency and the currency falls 5% to adjust? So that's another problem with having to have physical gold and move it around the world. And it's not only a question of who gets to store the gold, it's also a question of who gets to verify that the gold is real. It's still sitting there in a certain country's vaults where it should be, and has not just been replaced by gold-plated tungsten. And why should we trust whoever this is that's verifying this? We can see here in this tweet that this bar of gold turned out to be tungsten wrapped in an actual layer of gold. It's one thing to verify a single bar of gold, but when you need to do it for billions and billions of dollars and do it on an ongoing basis, this can be quite difficult and leads to you having to trust whoever that verifier is. Even in the US, it's impossible to know for sure how much gold actually is left inside of Fort Knox. This no longer matters because the US dollar is not backed by gold anymore. But if you can't trust the US government and you can't get straightforward answers from the US government about how much gold that it is actually holding, and they're unwilling to do an audit and to really show people that the gold is there. If you can't trust the US government on things like this, do you really want to have to trust China or Russia to assure you that the gold is actually there? And if you're conducting trade using this currency, you're going to want to know that the gold is actually there and that it's not just another form of fiat. I'll link to this article about the United States Bullion Depository, which is what Fort Knox is holding. The problem is the gold standard has already been tried and been found wanting. A gold standard always inevitably leads to, just because of the physical properties of gold, the fact that it's very heavy, it's very dense, and it's difficult to assay, especially when you have large quantities of it. This always leads to massive centralization and having to trust governments and central banks that they won't print more money than they have gold to back it. And this is what failure mode always looks like for gold. The issuer ends up issuing more paper than they have gold to back it. the issuer eventually is forced to suspend convertibility of that paper into that gold because there's not enough gold backing it, and you end up with something like fiat. This is what happened with the US dollar. The US printed more dollars than it had gold to back it in the 1950s and 1960s. Other countries got mad. I think it was in 1967 or 1968 that France actually sent a battleship to New York and the New York Fed to try to redeem its dollars, to exchange its dollars for actual physical gold, back when the US dollar was still convertible into gold. And what did Nixon do? What was his response? He just suspended the convertibility of US dollars into gold, and France was unable to take their gold. They were just left holding the gold IOUs instead. And this is what happens with a gold standard, because gold is difficult to move around. There was a lot of glee in the gold press seeing this news about BRICS possibly moving to a gold standard. And it makes me kind of sad, actually. I always feel like the gold bugs are the Charlie Browns of the investment world. They're always saying, we're finally going to win this time. And what happens, they're expecting to kick the football. The football gets pulled by Lucy, and they end up flat on their backs. And it looks like something similar might be happening again. India has came out on July 3rd, saying that they have no plans to join any sort of BRICS currency. And even the BRICS bank itself, the CFO says that this is not going to happen anytime soon. And as we've discussed, though, even if it does happen, it's not necessarily a good thing because it's so difficult to verify gold and to verify the backing. BRICS countries should just forget about creating their own shiny yellow rock currency, which is really a relic of past times, and they should just use Bitcoin instead for their trade. This makes a lot more sense. Bitcoin's digital money for a digital age. It doesn't need to be loaded onto boats and airplanes. Unlike gold bars, it's very simple to verify or assay. Bitcoin is very simple to store. It can even be stored in multiple physical locations. It can be stored in a brain wallet. Bitcoin, it can also be stored in a multi-sig wallet, which is a nice way of storing something in common. And Bitcoin, in addition to being simple to store, is not backed by anything that needs to be stored by a trusted third party. And if you have to trust a third party to store and facilitate redemptions in an asset that underlies a currency, as we had under the gold standard, that becomes a huge attack vector. You can either be attacked by external enemies or by internal enemies who want to print more money than there is gold to back it. I discussed the idea of Bitcoin not being backed by anything and why this is a good thing in this video, which I'll link to in the description notes below. Now, I often see in my comments that I see gold bugs suggesting that people should buy gold because central banks are buying a lot of gold. And that is in fact what they're doing. They're buying fewer US treasuries and they're buying more physical gold. But I think it's important to remember that these central banks are highly politicized entities. They're not investing for returns, but they're usually investing more with geopolitical objectives instead. And they have an abysmal investment track record. So if you loaded up on US treasuries, for example, when they were loading up on US treasuries over the past 10 years, your returns have actually been quite bad. Central banks are loading up on the one asset, gold, that will be the first to be demonetized by Bitcoin. And I find that quite amusing. If that's not poetic justice in economics, I really don't know what is. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.